Welcome everybody to the overview of Adaptation Concepts, Tools and Resources of the Climate Change Response Framework Project and the Adaptation Workbook. What this presentation is really answering is the question, how do we respond to climate change? And there's two major ways in which we can respond to climate change. One is the larger global greenhouse side of things, the mitigation side of things. Mitigation is really about those global cycles where managers are, I screwed it up again, Stacy, hold on. Okay, I'm gonna go back. It's early. We should have done this in like the afternoon.
Oh my
Okay.
God, no worries at all.
All right, here we go. So welcome everybody to Adaptation Concepts, an overview of the tools and resources that are part of the Climate Change Response Framework and the Adaptation Workbook. The question that we're here to answer today is, how do we respond to climate change? And there's two main ways that folks generally think about responding to climate change. One is mitigation and the other is adaptation. So just to dive into mitigation a little bit, mitigation is about reducing the amount of greenhouse gases that we can put into the atmosphere. It's also about removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere through forest carbon sequestration. And when we think about mitigation over the long term, the global carbon cycle takes many years to change, and so mitigation will often work on a much longer time frame than adaptation, which are the things that we can do now to address the physical manifestations of climate change. So adaptation then is those things that we can do in response to observed or anticipated effects of climate change. And so on any particular time scale, mitigation can be one goal that you're working toward, much like, timber harvest can be a goal, wildlife habitat can be a goal, mitigation can also be a goal, or more specifically, carbon sequestration. Adaptation then is really those actions that are going to help you achieve any one of those goals under a changing climate. And when we talk about adaptation in terms of natural systems, we define adaptation as the natural adjustment of systems in response to climate change. And from a forest manager's perspective, we're talking about adaptation actions that are designed to specifically address climate change impacts and vulnerabilities in order to meet our goals and objectives. We also want to recognize that adaptation is not necessarily anything new or different, but is often complementary to those good actions that you're already doing as forest managers. So working towards sustainable forest management, best management practices, conservation, restoration, climate change adaptation often works toward those same philosophies, but is really connecting the dots to those observed or anticipated climate impacts. We'd also like to recognize that forest managers face a number of different threats and stressors, different frameworks, different incentives that they need to deal with in order to manage any natural area. And climate change is one more thing that a forest manager really needs to keep in mind as they're thinking about how to meet their goals and objectives. Unfortunately, climate change is also expected to impact all of those other threats and stressors that forest managers tend to think about. So, what actions can help systems adapt to climate change and other threats while also meeting those landowner needs? If you want a single answer for how to respond to climate change, here it is. It depends. Sorry to disappoint you, but the answer is it depends on where you are working and what you're trying to achieve. So the where is very important because where you start out on the landscape is going to be different from your neighbor's place on the landscape. And so climate change impacts will be felt differently based on what soils you're working at, what elevations, you know, how exposed you are or protected to different threats and stressors. It will also depend on what you're trying to achieve. So climate change will impact timber harvesting goals differently than they'll impact wildlife habitat goals, and even among different wildlife species, climate change will appear differently based on different wildlife habitat goals. So it really depends on where you're working and what you're trying to achieve. So we couldn't give you a single answer for addressing climate change, but we have over the last decade created and have been working with landowners to use the Forest Adaptation Resources document, which is really a logical stepwise process for starting with your particular place and your management objectives and addressing climate change in a way that makes sense for any one particular person. So the Forest Adaptation Resources is a flexible workbook. It's a menu as well. It contains adaptation strategies and approaches that managers can pick and choose from in order to address their needs. The resource does not in itself make any recommendations either. It's really up to the landowner to identify what they're trying to do, where they are, how climate change might impact goals and objectives, and then identify those adaptation actions that really work for them in the most specific way possible. So the adaptation workbook is one important chapter in the FAR. The first step of the adaptation workbook is to define management goals and objectives, to define the systems that a manager is working in, and then also to define the timeline on which the manager is working. Step 2 then is to assess climate change impacts, and there are a number of resources. There are videos as part of the climate change response framework. There are vulnerability assessments, summaries, tree species handouts, and then other regional and national resources that can be drawn in as part of step 2. Many of those resources, however, are at the broad regional or national level. And so another part of step 2 is to think about how those broad regional trends actually manifest in your physical location. So for example, really capturing information about how your soils may make your site more or less vulnerable to climate change, or how your position in the larger topography might make your site more or less vulnerable. So then once we have a handle on climate change impacts, we move to step 3, which is to evaluate whether those impacts will help us meet our management objectives or make it more difficult to meet our management objectives. And so in step 3, we really think about management challenges and then also management opportunities. In step number 4, we use an adaptation menu to look at broad strategies and more specific approaches, and then finally we devise specific tactics, which are our adaptation actions, which are going to help us overcome those challenges or take advantage of the opportunities. And then finally, step 5 is to monitor and evaluate effectiveness. And so we think about the standard surveys and evaluations that we typically do after management, and then we think about how implementing our adaptation actions might bring to light any additional metrics, or if there are an intensity that we can change in terms of monitoring. So in a nutshell, that's the adaptation workbook, and it works really well with the adaptation menus. In the published version of the FAR, there are 2 different adaptation menus currently. One is for forestry and one is for urban forestry. On our website, forestadaptation.org/strategies, we also have menus for agriculture, forested watersheds, and tribal perspectives. And over the past decade, we've been building partnerships in each of the regions that we work in, and those partners have very different needs and have volunteered to lead efforts on preparing adaptation menus for other ecosystem types like wetlands and wildlife management, coastal ecosystems, forest carbon management, and recreation. And so all of those menus are set up in the same way, but really focus on different kinds of resources so that you can find the relevant menu that would really suit your needs. For each of the options, there are 10 strategies, and the options are really the most broad level of adaptation. Strategies then are almost asking the question, how would you implement those adaptation options? And so the hierarchy of each of these menus starts off with these options that move us from resistance to resilience, and then finally transition. And then the 10 strategies are describing ways that we can adapt to climate change. The hierarchy is essentially moving us from those broad concepts down into specific actions. And so at the broadest level, we have our options. And here it's listed as, you know, a concept. So resistance, resilience, and transition. And it's really moving us down in a stepwise fashion to get more and more specific with the ultimate goal of implementation of adaptation actions on the ground. And so here, you know, when we think about these broad adaptation options, I like to think of them in just managing either for persistence and trying to keep your ecosystem the same, or managing for change and really thinking about different levels of disturbance and whether the system can recover from that. In a little more detail, resistance are those actions that improve the defenses of the forest against change and disturbance. So this graphic shows a little bubble around your forest ecosystem, and we're really trying to ward off the effects of climate change and prevent the forest from experiencing significant disturbance so that we can maintain these relatively unchanged conditions over time. And this might be an option that you would choose for a short-term management goal. If you can protect a system as long as possible, then you might choose this option. It is less likely to be a feasible option in the long term as climate change continues to accelerate and the effects of climate change continue to become more and more pronounced. Resilience then accommodates some degree of climate change. So here the system is experiencing gradual change or perhaps more frequent or severe disturbances. And the options that we work toward here are trying to keep the forest as unchanged as possible, but recognizing that disturbance will happen. So actions here would help the forest rebound from disturbance and return to a relatively stable condition after disturbance. And then transition is recognizing that forest systems may not be able to return to prior conditions after change. And so actions here under the transition option would be to intentionally facilitate change and enable the ecosystem to respond to new and changing conditions. And so to help realign a forest ecosystem to these new and accelerating conditions. And so those are adaptation options of resistance, resilience, and transition. And it helps to just think about your forest goals and objectives and decide which of these really suit a project the best. The next step on the hierarchy is strategies. And so what strategies attempt to do is to take those broad, vague concepts and couch them in specific ideas. And so an example of a strategy from the forest menu is to sustain ecological functions. So that's, it sounds great. It sounds like a healthy thing to do for any ecosystem and can probably be applied to any ecosystem. You might wonder, though, what specifically you can do to sustain fundamental ecological functions. And under each strategy in the menu are several approaches that might tell you how to do that. And so for this example, the way to sustain fundamental ecological functions is to maintain or restore soil quality and nutrient cycling. And so how do we maintain or restore soil quality and nutrient cycling? The tactic will tell us exactly how to do that. And the tactic is developed by the forest manager or the natural resource manager to be that specific action that really lines up with what they're trying to do. So in this case, it's to delay operations in order to coincide with frozen ground disturbance or frozen ground in order to minimize disturbance. And then, as we decide which tactics we will ultimately implement in any forest management plan, we will also evaluate the benefits, the drawbacks, and then also the practicability and the time frame, so that in the end, we're really writing down any and every tactic that makes sense for this particular project, but ultimately we may only select a subset of those that really work well at this time. Writing them down, though, also provides a written record of the thought process that went into this, so that if if conditions change and new tactics can be implemented at a later date, then there's a record there. Also, at the same time, someone may think of a very specific adaptation tactic that just is a no-brainer for their adaptation project and their forest management plan altogether. So, for example, here, someone thought that planting future adapted oak species on south-facing slopes in spring was, the best way to help them meet their management goals and objectives. And so we write down that tactic, and then we simply match that tactic up with the appropriate approach, which is to emphasize drought and heat-tolerant species and populations. And the strategy that encompasses those approaches is to facilitate community adjustments through species transitions. And this particular example was really trying to facilitate change. And so it was really shooting for a transition option. But there are, many other examples in the forest adaptation resources that focus on resistance and resilience as well. And, the ultimate goal of the adaptation menus and the adaptation workbook is to connect the dots. And so we've talked a lot about management goals and objectives because that is a critical starting piece for the adaptation workbook. We really need to know where you are and what you're trying to do so that we can assess the climate change impacts on those goals and objectives. We can identify the challenges and opportunities related to managing for those goals and objectives under climate change. And then we can select options, strategies, and approaches that make it easier to take advantage of opportunities or overcome challenges. And the ultimate goal, again, is really to get from, thinking about climate change down to being able to respond to climate change on the ground. So again, actions for adaptation might not be very different from the good management that you're already doing. Actions for adaptation, however, are intentional. And again, it's really about connecting those dots and thinking about management goals and objectives, how your ecosystem will be changed by climate, how your goals are challenged, if they're still feasible or if you need to alter them, and then what specific actions can you do to address those impacts. And at the same time, because we allow space for other considerations, these climate-informed tactics, approaches, and strategies that are selected for implementation will still reflect any framework that you're working under. So throughout the process, we're allowing recognition that you might have restrictive mandates, you might have threatened and endangered species laws, you may be working against social values and public perception issues, or financial barriers or other considerations. And so in the end, these actions that are being selected have gone through these tests. We've thought about them, and we've still decided that some of these adaptation tactics are feasible and practicable. So just to recap, Adaptation actions can be often quite similar as best management principles, sustainable forest management, adaptive management, and any other, good example of land stewardship that you can think of. But here we're really focusing on applying climate change as we think about managing systems over time. The adaptation menu then really just helps organize and justify adaptation actions so that you're responding to distinct climate change impacts. The menu allows the user to pick and choose actions that are relevant to their situation so that when you take this adaptation workbook back to your coworkers or try to have a conversation with stakeholders or the public, the dots are connected very well to the thing that we're responding to. And then when managers need to implement adaptation tactics, those tactics have already been designed to really suit their particular need. They've been crafted by the manager because the manager ultimately knows what's best. So in a nutshell, that was the adaptation workbook and the adaptation menus and how we really walk through this process to help land managers start out from where they are and develop solid adaptation actions that really work for them. We have already over 250 examples of using the adaptation workbook with a variety of different landowners. So these are spread throughout the 20-state northeastern region and even beyond. Not all of them are online, but we have over 150, I think, already online. And you can look at forestadaptation.org/demos, and you can sort the different case studies, or as we call them, adaptation demonstrations, by ownership, by state, or by geographic area. So if you are a non-governmental organization and would like to look at other examples of NGO projects, you can sort by NGOs only. And these examples, again, are going to be unique examples. Each dot is a unique example because it is a specific landowner in a specific place dealing with a specific set of goals and objectives. And so these might give you some ideas and might really illustrate what adaptation looks like on the ground, but ultimately any new adaptation demonstrations are also going to be unique. So with that, I'm sure there will be time for questions built into the module. Otherwise, please visit us at forestadaptation.org, contact us, and we'll be happy to answer any questions or point you to a training page which would provide opportunities for different types of trainings. So with that, I will provide some additional resources that can be used for assessing climate change impacts and responding to climate change impacts. So thank you, and